Yeah, hi. Thanks for listening, and first, big thanks to the organizers for putting up PyCon Pune and letting me speak here. I'm going to talk about hacking mailing lists, the Mailman API ecosystem. And big disclaimer, this is not a talk about Mailman security, so it's not about black hat hacking mailing lists, but it's about the APIs that we can use within Mailman 3. So, yeah, a bit about me. My name is Florian Fuchs. I work for Red Hat on their OpenStack team on a project called O, which is a deployment tool for OpenStack. And more important for this talk, I'm also on the GNU Mailman developer team. And I mean, you all heard the awesome keynote of Hansa before, and he mentioned PyCon Chicago. And I just asked him what year it was, and he said it was 2008. And it's funny because 2009 was my first PyCon, and it was also in Chicago. And this is where I was introduced to the GNU Mailman developer team, and this is really what started my journey in open source. So that was kind of nice. So a quick poll. Who of you is using mailing lists to communicate regularly? Okay, so mailing lists are still there. So, so who of you is actually running their own mailing list? I see a couple of people I know, and anyone who's using Mailman 3? Excellent. Very good. So, yeah, the version of Mailman that probably most of you are using is Mailman 2, and it has been around for quite a while now, and it's still actively maintained, mostly by a great person, Mark Shapiro, and there are regular security updates and fixes and even new features. So it's still an active version, but the latest version of Mailman is actually Mailman 3, and this is the one I'm going to talk about. Not just because it's the latest version and we all want to use it, of course we do, but also because it introduces a couple of features which really open up Mailman for integration into all kinds of things. But before I start digging more concretely into these features, I'd like to give you a little bit of an overview of the different components in Mailman 3. So the Mailman suite. So what's the Mailman suite? Mailman 3, as opposed to Mailman 2, isn't just one piece of software that you install. It's a couple of projects that link together we call the Mailman suite. And the projects consist of the mailing list engine, a web UI, and an archiver UI. And all these three together build a complete Mailman 3 setup. So let's start. So at the heart of the Mailman 3 suite is what we call the Mailman core. So everything that has to do with email, like receiving emails, processing these emails, and sending it out to the mailing list subscribers, all that lives in the core. Also, the information about mailing lists, about users, members, that lives in the core as well in the database. And from a Python perspective, the Mailman core is also the Mailman package. So if you want to run your own mailing list, this is basically all you need. The core has a nice command line interface, which you can use to create mailing lists and subscribe people to it. So if you have a really small mailing list, you can just use the core. And you just have to hook it up to your MTA, like Postfix or Exim or whatever you're using, and then you can, you're ready to start. In most cases, however, you probably like to have a web UI where people can look up your list, descriptions, and subscribe themselves to those lists, and where list owners can manage their lists. So this is where a package named Postorius comes in, and this is a management web UI in Mailman 3. So everything from creating mailing lists and signing up users, changing settings and preferences, and moderating messages and subscription requests, all this can be done with this interface. So management is one thing. The other thing that you want from a web UI with a mailing list is probably a place where people can view and search list archives and view the actual content of a mailing list. And so this is where HyperKitty is for. Another package, another separate project, and this is the official Mailman 3 archiver web UI. Although I would say it's more like an archiver on steroids because it has a number of features that you wouldn't expect a normal archiver. So for instance, you can post from the UI, and in theory, you could opt out of using email for this mailing list completely. So both Posterius and HyperKitty are Django apps, and they share a single Django project configuration, and together they are the Mailman 3 web UI. So the question is, if these projects are technically separate, how do they communicate? And now we come a little bit closer to the topic of my talk. So the Mailman core exposes a REST API. So communication to manage email mailing lists is basically done via HTTP. So this means it makes the management very independent of the underlying core engine and also the development of the web UI projects. So in theory, Posterius and HyperKitty could be written in a completely different language than Python. So you might say, who would want to do that and use anything else but Python? But in theory, it's possible. And the point, of course, is that it makes it incredibly easy to integrate Mailman into other systems. But there's another reason why this is good, because the REST API hides a lot of the complexity of the core in REST resources. And especially for me when I started, that was really, really, really good, because when I joined the Mailman team, I had no idea about email and how email actually works. And email is actually pretty hard. So, but I didn't have to get into that. I had to learn about the mental model of mailing lists, and all the complexity that's underneath it was hidden behind this nice REST API. So I could really start with learning Python, and then starting working on the first version of what later became Posterius. So anyway, we use REST as a transport system. But for those of you who've used like HTTP calls extensively, it can become a little bit tedious to work with HTTP requests and responses, handle errors, and so forth. And so, because there was a lot of repetition, we developed a fourth package to make that a little bit easier, and it's called Mailman Client. And it sits sort of between the web UI projects, Posterius and HyperKitty, and the core engine. So it's sort of a wrapper around the REST API, and it turns the REST calls into handy little Python objects that you can operate on. It's used by both Posterius and HyperKitty, but it's a separate package, so it can be used by pretty much any third-party application as long as they use Python 2.7, 3.4, or 3.5. Probably even 3.6, but that's not part of the test suite yet. So, so the REST API is for management, meaning like setting up lists and so forth. But what about the content of a mailing list, the actual posts? So the REST those don't sit in the REST API, because obviously the REST API wouldn't be a good place for that, because like all the management goes in the direction Posterius or HyperKitty ask the core for something and give something back. But with mailing list posts, we want to go the communication go in the other direction. Like when a new post is sent out to the list subscribers, the archiver needs to be notified of that. So the mechanism that Mailman provides here is called the iArchiver interface. And it sits inside the Mailman source code, and it's kind of a blueprint for developers to be able to very easily create a simple class that really hooks into that moment when a message is about to leave the Mailman core and be sent out to the subscribers. So we have these two APIs, these two interfaces. The REST API is for management, and the iArchiver interface is for content. So you can use them in different ways. For instance, You can use them to integrate Mailman into other systems. Like, for instance, you could automatically subscribe people that are joining your organization based on whatever tools you use. And if you don't want to get through the tedium of having to add every new person to a new mailing list, you could automate that. You could enhance your tools, enhance your mailing list setup. And there are many ways that are thinkable. For instance, you could just just use Mailman 3, the setup as it is, be happy with it, and then say there's this one piece of thing of functionality that is missing for me. Like, I want to listen for the mailing list posts, and for instance, if something comes up that's of interest somewhere else, like, for instance, you have a mailing list for your open source project, and you post a release announcement on your mailing list, you could add that functionality that looks for posts that look like a release announcement, and use those and turn those into a blog post and post them to WordPress automatically, or a static site generator or something. Or you could think a little bit beyond mailing lists, because if you look at the Mailman core, it's more like, at the heart of it, it's just a tool for groups to communicate that only happens to use email as a transport. But it doesn't mean it has to look like a classic mailing list. It could also be integrated into some kind of your web application, be used as a backend for notifications in groups, and so forth. So let's get our hand a little dirty with some examples. Let's start with the REST API. So there are a few things to note about the REST API. First, it needs authentication, but it doesn't do authorization. So once you're in, you're in. You need a username and password, but then you have access to everything. Like, you can delete everything and leave. That would be possible. So it's really up to the application that uses the REST API to come up with policies that authorizes people to do certain things, like, for instance, only a moderator can moderate a message, or only a list owner can delete that list, and so forth. And as a consequence of this, the API is not meant for public consumption and only runs on localhost. For now, just a little glimpse in the future. There's an upcoming project in Mailman 3 that adds an authentication layer on top of the REST API, so we can keep the actual API simple, but there's also going to be this layer around the API to make it possible to expose it out to the public. So the plan is to implement a set of default authorization policies, but also enable folks to plug their own policies in. So the thing is, the project has currently exactly 0 lines of code. So this could be a thing to sprint about after the conference. So how do we start the REST API? So the first thing that you have to do is you have to import the client class from Mailman client. Make an instance of this. So the client class takes 3 arguments. One is the REST API's URL. It listens on port 8001. And you need a password and a username. And those are set in the central Mailman config file. The client instance that you get back has a system attribute. This is kind of a more boring one. It gives a little bit of information about the Mailman version, the Python version. So it has a lists property, which is currently empty. And it has a domains property with currently empty as well, because we haven't created anything yet. So one thing about domains, Mailman 2 was also aware of domains, but in a way where you could only use the list name once, even over separate domains. And so the awareness of domains in Mailman 3 has been improved a lot. So domains are the base level entity that you have to use. So let's create a domain first. You can see I'm using Mailman client here, but I've put the actual REST URL that is called in a little comment, so you can see what's this is kind of what's going on in the background, the actual request. So we create a local domain, example.org, using the create domain method of the client object. And what we get back is a domain instance. If the domain is already existing, we don't use the create domain, but the get domain method, and get back the same thing. So now that we have a domain, we can start creating mailing lists. So in this example, I'm creating a mailing list called Jabberwocky. I don't know if you heard about it. That's an 80s movie made by Monty Python member Terry Gilliam. It's very crazy. It's also very gross, and it's very funny. So Jabberwocky. Also, the name is good. So yeah. So create list on the domain object will get you back a list object. So we have a list now. If we want to operate on a pre-existing list, we would just, like with the domains before, use the get list, not the create list method. But we use the one on the client instance, so we don't have to. So if the list is already existing, we don't have to get the domain first. We can just get it right from the client object. So now, if you look at the list property of the client object, we see that the Python list that we came back isn't empty anymore. We have one list in there. Right. So lists have settings. So the Jabberwocky list object that we just created has settings properties, and this will give you a huge Python dictionary. Put the ellipses there to keep the example simple, and one of them is the display name. One of them is the description, which is empty by default. So if we want to add a description, we just assign a description string to the description key of the settings property and hit settings.save. What this will do, it will send a patch request, as you can see in the comment here, to 3.0 list jabberwocky example.org config. So for those who are not that familiar with HTTP verbs, patch is a little bit of an unusual one. It acts a little bit like the put verb in HTTP, only that it allows to send only a subset of the resource back. So this could be merged into the existing config object in this case. Members. We have a list on a domain, and we have set the settings of the list that we wanted to change. Now a list needs members if it wants to have any meaning at all. And again, we use the Jabberwocky list object that we've created to subscribe someone. So it takes a couple of arguments. First, an email address. Everyone subscribed to a mailing list needs an email address for that. An optional name. Dennis is, by the way, the main character in Jabberwocky, so I chose that. The name isn't mandatory. It will show up maybe in notification emails and so forth. It could be used by web UIs and so forth, but it's not a mandatory option. The two keyword arguments that I put there are a little bit more important, pre-confirmed and pre-verified. So if I don't use them or put them to false, when Mailman receives this request, it will say, okay, I have a request for a membership for a guy named Dennis on the Jabberwocky list. So there are a couple of things that I don't know. First, I don't know if this email address exists at all. And second, I don't know if this person actually wants to subscribe to that list. So what Mailman will do will send out a notification email to dennis@example.com, and depending on whether pre-confirmed, verified is set to false, or both of them or only one of them, ask them to confirm their mailing list, their email address by clicking on a verification link in the email, or send an email back, or asking Dennis if he actually wants to be subscribed to Jabberwocky at example.org. So, but there are cases, for instance, with Posterius, with the Mailman web UI, where a person is already logged in, and we know the email address is correct and existing, and we also know that the person actually wants to be subscribed to the Jabberwocky list. And so we can set the pre-confirmed and pre-verified flags to true, And so Mailman will know, okay, this is good, and will just give us back a new member object because in the background, a new member has been created for this list. So, and now the Jabberwocky.members attribute isn't an empty list anymore. It contains the first member. So if we want to do something with Dennis, and he has been subscribed before, we can get the Dennis member object by using the getMember method on the Jabberwocky list object using Dennis's email address. And of course, everyone who's subscribed to an email list can also be unsubscribed. We can do this in two ways. We could either use the Jabberwocky list object and use the unsubscribe method using Dennis's email address, or we can just use the Dennis member object and hit the unsubscribe method. Preferences. Members have preferences. That could be different things. It could be like the delivery status. Do I want to receive email mailing list messages, or would I like to stop for a while? Would I like to get an email for each mailing list post, or just a plain text digest every evening? So those can be saved as well. This is done on the member object using the preferences attribute, and we can just assign one of these preferences to the object and hit save again. And the preferences can also be set globally for the whole installation or for a mailing list. But in this case, like the member preferences would have preferences over the client's, the global preferences. So, but you could use it to set some defaults, like delivery status is enabled by default and everyone gets regular mailing list posts, not just digests. So there's more. I showed you the most important things, but of course there's a couple of things that I don't have the time to mention here. You can define list owners and moderators. You can moderate subscription requests and messages using the REST API. You can manage user addresses, like changing email addresses, or add extra email addresses to a user. You can access internal Mailman queues, and you can also create your own header matching rules. These are rules which are determine if a message is moderated or not. But you can read the docs. We have extensive docs because the docs are basically our test suite for the Mailman client, and you can find all kinds of things that you can do with the REST API there. So much for the REST API. Now the IArchiver interface, that's the one, as I said, the REST API is basically for management of mailing lists, and the IArchiver interface is for the content of mailing lists, like the mailing list posts. So there are 3 steps involved here, or 3 things. First of all, you need an implementation of the IArchiver interface, and it needs to be importable as a modular package. You need to register your implementation in Mailman config, so Mailman knows about it. And optionally, you can have some external configuration for it. So maybe the IArchiver, the I in front of the IArchiver and the word interface sounds a lot of bells here, because you might say, well, Python doesn't have interfaces like in the way that other languages have interfaces. So that's true, but Mailman uses a package called Zope interface to add similar functionality to be able to make sure that if someone implements their own archiver, they do it in a way that's actually conforming to the blueprint of an archiver. So I'm going to show you the class in the next slide. So but the first thing you have to do is you have to register your archiver in the Mailman config. Like it's an ini style config, and you just add another section with an archiver prefix. In this case, archiver, demo archiver. The class attribute is the Python path to your archiver class. Enable yes or no. That means is this archiver enabled by default or not? So if it sets to no, you can still choose if you want to activate this archiver for a single mailing list or not. But enable yes means like by default this will be called for every mailing list post on every mailing list. And you can put an option configuration path if you have some extensive configuration needs for your archiver. So if we look at the actual class, let's look at the imports first. So the first two import from Mailman config, and this is basically to load the configuration for your archiver. It's not mandatory, so you don't necessarily need it. But what's important is the third and the fourth line, where it imports the actual iArchiver interface and the implementer decorator from the Zope interface package. And so before the class is defined, you just put on top of it the decorator call with the iArchiver interface in it as an argument. So Mailman can ensure that before it calls methods on these archiver classes, it actually, that the class conforms to the standard. And also you could use this in your test suite to make sure whenever you change something there, you make sure it's always conforming to the iArchiver interface blueprint. So the class has a name, it's, in this case, demo archiver. In this case, I use the init function method to load the external configuration. And then there are three mandatory methods. The first two, list_url and permalink, are to give Mailman information if if the mailing list post that's going to be archived is accessible somewhere on the net. Like list_url should return a URL to the list archives, and permalink to the concrete mailing list post in this case. But not every archiver is present on the web. Someone could be just there to take a mailing list post, do something with it, but it will never show up on the web anywhere as a classic archiver. So you could return none. In this case, you still have to implement these two methods, but they can just return none. And then the most important method here is the archive message method, which actually does the thing. It takes two arguments, a mailing list and a message argument, and this is handed to the archiver by the Mailman core, and you can use it to see to look into what the mailing list posts and its context. For instance, the message object is an instance of the email messages class in the standard library, so it's very well documented. You can use the usual get methods, for instance, get for the subject header, or get payload for the message body, or you could traverse the all the message elements in there, look for attachments and so forth. But that's pretty well documented. And you could use, for instance, the mailing list argument and the list name property to get the mailing list name. So, so this implementation of iArchiver doesn't do anything. It's just an example of how you could access the information and do something else with it. For instance, in this case, we could, if we wanted to create a blog post from that, we could read out the subject mail header and get to the mail body of the mailing list post and just create a Markdown file or a Pelican file, or just post it to WordPress or whatever you're using for a blog post. So, a third thing that I haven't mentioned before, but it's probably worth mentioning, we've talked about how you can manage mailing lists using the REST API and how to access the content using the iArchiver interface, but how do we automatically get something into Mailman? So the answer could be, well, you could just post an email to the mailing list. And of course, that's a crude way, but working way to do it. But we could also use two other more nice ways. So let's create a little message here. It's a really simple message. It just has a from header, a to header, which is the mailing list. It has a subject and a mail body, and it needs to have a message ID. And the reason for it is it will get rejected by Mailman if it doesn't have a unique message ID, because that is used for threading. It's usually added automatically by MTAs like postfix, but if we do that without an MTA, it will we will need it ourselves, and there's a nice little tool from the email utils package in the standard library. So one way we could put this into Mailman would be LMTP, which is actually the thing that an MTA like Postfix would use to add something into Mailman. So the Mailman core listens on port 8024, has a little LMTP server, and we could just create a little server instance and use the sendMail method to send this message to Mailman locally. Another way to do it would be the REST API. I told you before, the REST API has access to Mailman queues, and the most basic queue, the first queue a mailing list will arrive in is the in queue. So we could use the client object we created before when I told you about the REST client and inject the message as a text string into this queue, and it will travel all the way through Mailman. Right, so that's it, thank you. If you want to contribute or are interested, want to listen in what's happening with Mailman, we have a mailing list, of course, mailmandevelopers@python.org. The Mailman 3 repos are on GitLab. We have a Mailman group there. And if you're interested in doing something with Mailman, on contributing, starting to contribute or work on the dynamic project, the authenticated API project or something else, see me at the developer sprints. Thanks. I think we have some time for questions, if there are any.
Okay. So my question may seem a little gross here, but there is a simplified version of it also, which I would like to ask. Assuming I'm running a Mailman within my organization, employees come and employees, through attrition, get out of the organization. They subscribe to a mailing list, but when they exit the organization, they don't get themselves unsubscribed. And we don't have a mechanism, let's say, of automatically removing them when they're leaving the organization. At some point in time, the lists will start growing and will grow a lot. What is the mechanism to actually deal with such a situation?
So just if I understood this right, so you subscribe to someone to a automatically subscribe someone to your mailing list, but then you don't have a mechanism to automatically unsubscribe people. And is that right? So what would be a good solution?
It's not as if they would be automatically subscribed to it.
Yeah.
But because of the utility that is provided by the group, they would want to subscribe themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And so they could subscribe, they get all the mails and so on that they want. But when they exit the organization, they don't unsubscribe. And my list keeps growing.
Okay, so, well, first of all, if there's no automation, you could build one, of course, or you could just use the REST API or the interface, the existing interface to look up the list of members for that mailing list and see if you can unsubscribe them by hand. But Mailman will not just. So one thing it does is if an email address isn't working anymore, for instance, so that will not get used a second time when it's broken. So this is one thing where Mailman will clear up non-existing email addresses. But if you want to, but if people subscribe and the list is, I mean, in theory the database holds a great many lists of members. So, but you'd really have to create a mechanism to do that yourself.
So my husband manages literally tens of thousands of Mailman 2 mailing lists.
Wow.
Yeah. At some point, a developer found that as a hammer and just used it to solve everything. So what is the pain level of moving over to Mailman 3?
So
In that
is a really good question. So there is no official migration path yet for moving from Mailman 2 to Mailman 3. There are some migration scripts out in the wild. I think the people who have done the migration for the Fedora lists have used some of those, but there's no official way yet. We're planning on doing that, of course. What I could tell you is that if you have really tens of thousands of mailing lists, then it could be worth the hassle of upgrading, because in Mailman 2, the information for each mailing list is stored in a Python pickle file. And whereas in Mailman 3, it's stored in a proper database. And that makes handling many mailing lists a lot easier and more performant as well. So I cannot right now give you good news about, it's very easy. Just, use this script or press this button and then you're done and have Mailman 3. There could be such thing in the future. We have some people here who might be willing to sprint on that, maybe. But in this particular case, it could be worth the work, definitely.
Hi. Thanks for the very informative examples. I have a question regarding tools and scripts. Is it possible that you can import mails in other file formats into Mailman 3?
You mean mails from other file?
Yes. Yeah.
So the question was if it's possible to import mails from other file formats into Mailman 3. Well, you could. Let's say it depends. What you could do is you could do the conversion yourself and then use LMTP or the REST API to inject them into Mailman. But what would happen would be those would be sent out as mailing list posts the moment you inject them. But if you want to import them into an existing archiver, that's kind of outside of the Mailman core and outside of the REST API, because Mailman doesn't store the mails in a central place, but that's up to the archiver. So for instance, if you use HyperKitty, like the official archiver, you'd have to convert the mails into the format that HyperKitty uses and then store it there. Or if you want to write your own archiver, you'd have the conversion there. But that will be outside of the Mailman core.
So in iArchiver, you mentioned to import ZOP interface.
I can't hear it.
In iArchiver, you mentioned to import the ZOP interface. What is it exactly, this ZOP interface? It is the same ZOP web server which Plone uses, or it is some other ZOP?
Well, it's not part of the Plone project. It's separate. I think it has the same roots, but it's a separate project. And so there's something called the ZOP component architecture, which makes components pluggable by using things like interfaces and so forth. And it's part of that. And it's kind of adding a little bit of a way of doing things to Python that people might know from other languages, and interfaces are one example of that. And it's basically just to make sure that you have a blueprint and you're using some third-party extension that conforms to your blueprint. But it's a separate project, separate from Plone, as far as I know. Yeah.
So I have one question. Say, these are like REST APIs, right? How secure are they? For example, if there are like a couple of emails or malicious emails, can you filter it out?
Oh, okay. So yeah, that's a common question about like spam filtering in Mailman. Well, we usually the default answer is that we use that spam filtering is up to the MTA, something like postfix, because usually the MTAs have the machinery to do spam checking, like asking repositories like SpamHours and so forth, and using all kinds of algorithms to detect spam. And so we assume that an email that enters Mailman isn't spam. Of course, a list that is set to that only subscribers can send to them. So if the sender is real and has been checked, so that will we can assume that it's a legit subscriber that's posting the email. But the question comes around every now and then, so there's the possibility that someone might add some functionality to Mailman, which does basic spam checking, but at the moment it's not there. At the moment, it's really up to the MTA, like postfix or XM, to do the spam checking.
Thank you.
We are out of time, so that's all the questions you can take. You can always catch him on the corridor and ask your questions and join in the sprint. Thanks.
Right, thanks. Sure.